The interrogation room was silent. Admiral Exorvath of the Tzikari Dominion stared at the report in his trembling claws, his twin hearts hammering inside his armored chest. His mandibles twitched in growing horror as he read the contents. Then he looked up, his 3 golden eyes locking onto the trembling officer standing before him. "Tell me," Exorvath said, his voice deadly calm, "that this is some kind of mistranslation." The officer, a lanky Tzikari ensign with pale gray chitin, swallowed hard. It is not, Admiral." Exorvatha's grip crushed the data tablet in his claws. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his throat as he leaned forward. "You, imprisoned, human, children." The ensign's mandibles quivered. They were found trespassing in Dominion airspace, sir. We believe them to be spies or—" Exorvath slammed his fist into the table, sending a deafening boom through the chamber. The metal frame buckled under the force, and the ensign flinched violently. "Spies?" Exorvath hissed. "Spies. Do you have any idea what you have done?" The ensign's breathing was shallow. "Sir, we have detained the juveniles on Outpost Theta 9 under maximum security protocols. They are unharmed. The humans have been notified of—" Exorvath surged forward, grabbing the ensign by the throat. "You imbecile," he snarled, his fangs bared. "Unharmed? Unharmed? We are all already dead." The ensign gasped, choking, his eyes wide with confusion and terror. "But sir, they're just children. The humans will understand that." Exorvatha's eyes burned with fury. "You are a fool," he growled. "A blind, naive fool." The door to the interrogation chamber slid open and another officer, Commander Rilvash, Exorvatha's most trusted advisor, rushed in, his chitin slick with nervous sweat. "Admiral," he said, panting. "It's too late." Exorvath turned his head slowly, releasing the ensign. The younger officer collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, but neither senior officer paid him any further attention. "How bad?" Exorvath asked, his voice now dangerously quiet. Rilvash swallowed. "The humans know." Exorvath felt his blood run cold. "How?" "Their fleet, sir, it's already moving." A long, terrible silence settled over the room. Then softly, "How many ships?" Rilvash's mandibles clicked nervously. "All of them, sir." The humans were coming. The Tzikari Dominion was vast. A proud, powerful empire that had expanded across hundreds of star systems, ruled through iron will and military precision. They had defeated the drone warlords, shattered the Rethkar Union, and crushed the Vialor uprising before it even began. They were feared, respected. But there was one species they had never dared provoke. And now they had done the unthinkable. They had given humanity a reason to fight. Exorvath strode toward the command deck, his mind racing. Every step felt like a march toward oblivion. The humans would not negotiate. The humans would not hesitate. The humans would burn everything to the ground. And it would be justified. Because nothing provoked human wrath like harming their young. The warning came too late. "Put me through to the human fleet," Exorvath barked as he entered the bridge. The Tzikari technicians scrambled to comply. The massive holo display flickered to life, revealing a towering figure, a human admiral in dark blue combat armor, standing rigid, his expression frozen fury. Admiral Jonas Rourke. The moment Exorvath saw his face, he knew there would be no peace. Behind Rourke, the bridge of his flagship was a storm of activity, officers moving with deadly purpose. The distant hum of weapons charging sent a sickening wave of dread through the Tzikari officers. The human admiral's eyes locked onto Exorvath's. Then, slowly, in a voice that barely concealed his rage, he spoke. "Return them. Now." Exorvath straightened, choosing his next words carefully. "Admiral Rourke, Rourke did not blink. "Now." Exorvath's mandibles tightened. "Admiral, I assure you they are unharmed. This was a misunderstanding. They are children." The words cut through the air like a blade. Rourke's fists clenched at his sides. Exorvath could see the tension in every human officer behind him. Their jaws were set, their eyes dark, their hands poised over weapons that were already armed. One wrong sentence. That's all it would take. "Admiral," Exorvath said carefully, "the juveniles will be returned to you immediately. There is no need for conflict." Rourke's voice was ice. "There is already conflict. You just don't know it yet." A chill ran down Exorvath's spine. "Sir," a Tzikari officer whispered. "Human fleet formations are shifting." Exorvath's blood froze. "What?" A technician swallowed hard. "Their ships are moving, sir. They're preparing for an orbital bombardment. Exorvath turned back to Rourke, his throat dry. Admiral, he tried again. You must understand. I understand perfectly, Rourke cut him off. His next words were pure venom. You stole our children. You caged them like animals. And now you will learn what happens when you cross that line. The comm signal cut out. For a long, dreadful moment, Exorvath simply stood there, staring at the blank screen. Then, Sir Rilvash whispered. They're locking weapons. The Abyss stared back. Exorvath turned to his officers. Send a transmission to all Dominion outposts, he said, his voice low, shaking. Evacuate all non-essential personnel. Now. The bridge fell into chaos. Commands were shouted, emergency signals flared, but deep down, everyone knew the truth. It was already too late. Because humanity wasn't here to negotiate. They weren't here to talk. They were coming. Not to win a war. Not to expand their territory. But to make sure this never happened again. And for the first time in the long, proud history of the TZ Dominion, they were afraid. Above them the stars began to burn. The sky above Outpost Theta 9 was on fire. Exorvath stood frozen on the command deck, his golden eyes wide with something he had never felt before. Terror. Because the humans hadn't waited. They hadn't sent diplomats. They hadn't responded to reassurances. They hadn't even demanded further explanations. They had simply arrived. And now they were tearing the outpost apart. The first strike. It started with the silence. One moment, Outpost Theta 9's orbital defenses were operational. Shields were at full power, planetary defense cannons tracking the void above, a standard security formation in place. The next moment, all systems died. The command deck plunged into darkness, emergency lights flickering to life as screens crackled with static. Officers scrambled to restore communications, their mandibles clicking in nervous confusion. Admiral. An ensign choked out. Every system is down. Shields are offline. Communications. Then the bombardment began. A human dreadnought, a towering steel behemoth that dwarfed the TZ warships in orbit, opened fire. Kinetic railguns thundered, sending solid tungsten slugs raining down onto the outpost like meteors. The first impact obliterated a fortified structure in an instant. The second caved in a weapons facility. The third? That one took out an entire battalion of Dominion soldiers before they could even reach their weapons. Exorvath's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Return fire, he roared. Sir, our targeting systems are. I don't care. Fire everything manually. The outpost's remaining ground defenses lurched to life, spitting plasma bolts and flak rounds into the sky, but it was already too late. The humans were not interested in a fair fight. They had shut down the Dominion's weapons, severed their communications and obliterated their defenses before they could react. And now, the drop pods were falling. The reckoning begins. From the burning skies, thousands of black iron drop pods crashed into the outpost, slamming into the scorched ground with enough force to crater the surface. And then they opened. Human soldiers poured out like demons from the void. They moved with precision, their weapons humming with lethal energy. Not a single step was wasted. The first wave of TZ defenders never even got a shot off. The second wave held the line for a full minute before being cut down. And the third wave? They saw what happened to the first two. And ran. Exorvath watched in stunned horror as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. TZ warriors, some of the most feared soldiers in the Dominion, were fleeing. Not because they were cowards, but because they saw what the humans were doing to those who resisted. No survivors, no mercy. The Dominion was used to war. They understood conquest, power, dominance. But the humans? They didn't fight to conquer. They fought to punish. And right now their punishment was absolute. Exorvath's claws gripped the console as the command center shook violently. Another direct hit. He turned to his officers. All remaining forces, fall back to the prison sector. The children were still there. Perhaps, just perhaps, the humans would pause if they found their own alive and well. It was a foolish hope, one that even Exorvath barely believed, but right now it was the only chance they had. The monster in the hallway. The security ward of the outpost was in chaos. TZ guards scrambled to reposition themselves, sealing bulkhead doors and setting up defensive lines. In the heart of the prison sector, 6 human children sat huddled in a containment cell, their wide, terrified eyes locked onto the flickering lights above. Something's coming, one of the older ones whispered. And then, the walls exploded. A TZ guard was flung across the hallway, his armor crushed inward as if he had been hit by a starship. Smoke filled the corridor. Sparks rained from the ceiling. And through the haze, a single human soldier stepped inside. Tall, armored in dark, unmarked plating. His visor glowed with an eerie red hue. He did not speak. He did not need to. Because when the Tzikari saw him, they dropped their weapons. Not because of fear. Because of what was behind him. The wrath of humanity. The rest of the human strike force stepped in. And then the slaughter began. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The Tzikari never stood a chance. The humans moved too fast, struck too precisely, and killed without hesitation. It was surgical. Unrelenting. Efficient. The guards were cut down in seconds and then, just as quickly, the cell doors were breached. The oldest human child, a girl no older than 10, looked up at the towering soldier standing before her. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She simply nodded. The soldier's visor tilted slightly in acknowledgement. Then, without a word, he lifted her onto his back, securing her in place. The others followed. And then, the order came through the comms. One the humans had been waiting for. One the Tzikari would never forget. Burn it all. In the skies above, the human fleet adjusted course. Their weapons shifted, no longer firing at defenses but at the planet itself. The ground beneath Exorvath shook violently as the first planetary bombardment wave hit. His mandibles trembled. They weren't just taking back the children. They were erasing the outpost. Every structure. Every soldier. Every trace of its existence. And as the sky turned to fire, Exorvath finally truly understood. This wasn't a war. This was a reckoning. And humanity was delivering its judgment. The beginning of the end. From orbit, Admiral Jonas Rourke watched the outpost burn. His fists were clenched, his jaw locked. One of his officers, Commander Avery, stood beside him, arms crossed. "The children?" she asked. "Safe," Rourke replied. Avery exhaled, shaking her head. "The Dominion will never forget this." Rourke's eyes never left the burning world below. "They don't have to," he said. Pause. Then. "They just need to remember not to try it again." The Dominion had committed the worst mistake in the galaxy. And now, they were paying the price. The Dominion's vast empire had always stood unchallenged. Its fleets had burned 100 worlds. Its soldiers had crushed rebellions before they could begin. Its rulers had ruled with an iron claw for centuries. But now, for the first time, the Dominion was learning fear. Not fear of war. Not fear of battle. Fear of what it had just unleashed. The humans had taken their children back. And they were not finished yet. The hunt begins. Across the Dominion, the impossible was happening. Entire military outposts had gone silent. Warships that had stood guard for decades were drifting ruins. High-ranking officials had vanished without a trace. At first, the Dominion High Command had believed it to be a fluke. That was before they realized what was really happening. The humans weren't retreating. They were systematically dismantling everything. Strike teams were slipping into secure Dominion space, assassinating officers, erasing records, leaving only burning wreckage behind. No messages. No negotiations. No mercy. It was not a war. It was retribution. And the Dominion had no way to stop it. The vanishing fleet. Admiral Exorvath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Zalcor, staring at the latest battle reports in cold dread. The Dominion had already lost 32 planets. Not conquered. Erased. Cities leveled. Fleets annihilated. Supply chains shattered beyond repair. And then, the worst part. The human fleet was nowhere to be found. "They keep disappearing," muttered Commander Rilvash, his claws gripping the console. "Our scouts can't track them. Every time we think we know where they are, they've already moved." Exorvath remained silent. The humans were not fighting like the Dominion. They weren't massing fleets, engaging in battles of honor. They were hunting. "They don't need to hold territory," Exorvath murmured. "They don't need to conquer." He turned, his golden eyes dark with realization. "They just need to make sure we don't exist anymore." A chilling silence settled over the bridge. Then, "Sir," a trembling officer whispered. "Incoming transmission. It's them." A message from the abyss. The hollow display crackled to life. Admiral Jonas Rourke stood on the screen. His armor was scorched, battle-worn. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held no warmth. "Admiral Exorvath," he said, voice steady. "You have one chance." Exorvath forced himself to remain calm. "To what?" Rourke's expression did not change. "To surrender?" Murmurs rippled across the bridge. Surrender? The Dominion had never surrendered to anyone. Rilvash stepped forward. You think we will just... You already have, Rourke cut him off. The screen split, showing a live tactical map of Dominion space. Entire fleets, gone. Armories, destroyed. Trade routes cut off. Everything the Dominion needed to function as an empire was already ashes. You think you're still fighting a war, Rourke said, tilting his head slightly. You're not. This war ended the moment you put those kids in a cage. Exorvath clenched his claws. You act as if we had planned this, he said, his voice low. It was a mistake. A terrible one, but... Rourke's eyes turned cold. There are no mistakes with children. His voice dropped to a whisper. You took them. You imprisoned them. If we hadn't come, what would have happened to them? Do you even know? Exorvath didn't. And that was the worst part. The High Command had viewed it as a simple containment operation, not realizing the consequences of their actions. Now they were watching their empire burn for it. Exorvath took a slow breath. And what happens if we surrender? Rourke's voice did not soften. You live? A long pause. Not as rulers, Rourke continued. Not as an empire. As survivors. Exorvath narrowed his eyes. You mean to break us? Rourke exhaled. No. His gaze was unshakable. You broke yourselves? The final hour. The Dominion High Council met that night. The most powerful leaders of the empire, gathered in desperate secrecy. They debated. They argued. Some called for surrender. Others called for total war. But Exorvath already knew the truth. The Dominion had already lost. The humans would not stop. Not until they were sure this would never happen again. And so, in the ruins of their once mighty empire, the High Council made the hardest decision in their history. They ordered the transmission. They called for unconditional surrender. And across the galaxy for the first time in centuries, the Dominion's war engines fell silent. The cost of mercy. Admiral Jonas Rourke received the message in silence. On the bridge of his flagship, he listened as the Dominion's surrender was confirmed, as their fleet stood down, as their worlds opened their gates. The war was over. And yet, Rourke did not feel like celebrating. They'll rebuild, Commander Avery said beside him. Eventually, Rourke nodded. Maybe. Avery hesitated. Should we have finished them? Rourke exhaled slowly. I don't know. The Dominion had paid a price for their mistake. The war had cost billions of lives. And yet, it was restraint that won the final battle. Because humans had done something the Dominion never expected. They had left them alive. To remember. To live with what they had done. To know that the moment they forgot, humanity would be waiting. The end of an empire. Exorvath stood on the shattered balcony of the Dominion capital, watching as the first human ships landed peacefully. Not as conquerors. As watchmen. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon him. The Dominion would never be the same. And humanity? They would never forget. Because some lines could never be crossed. And the last time someone had tried, it had nearly ended them. The galaxy would never be the same again. The war was over. But the scars it left behind would never heal. Across the Dominion, the wreckage of once mighty fleets drifted in silence. Smoldering cities lay in ruins, their once proud banners torn to ash. The High Command had surrendered, their empires stripped bare, their power broken. And yet they were still alive. That was humanity's final message. They could have ended everything. They could have exterminated the Dominion down to the last hatchling. But instead, they left them to remember. Because in the end, that was a far worse punishment. The occupation fleet. Admiral Jonas Rourke stood aboard the USS Valkyrie, watching the remnants of the TZ-Carry Dominion through the reinforced viewport. The once feared alien empire now existed under human watch. Not as rulers. Not as an empire. But as a people on borrowed time. A holographic display flickered beside him. An image of Admiral Exorvath, his reptilian form seated at a cold, metallic desk in what had once been the Dominion's grandest war room. Now it was a prison. The TZ-Carry leader looked smaller than before. The fire that once burned in his golden eyes had dimmed. You are free to govern yourselves, Rourke said, his voice measured. You will rebuild. You will recover. Exorvath's mandibles twitched, but he said nothing. Rourke stepped closer to the display. His next words were like a knife sliding into the heart of the broken empire. But understand this, you are never free of us. Exorvath's claws tightened into fists. Your people will live, Rourke continued. Your children will grow. Your civilization will survive. Then his expression hardened. But the moment you forget what happened here, the holoscreen glitched for a second, revealing live feeds from the Dominion's ruined military strongholds. Wrecked TZ-carry dreadnoughts sinking into the void. Burned-out war academies, their teachings erased. Desolate armories, their weapons confiscated. Rourke's voice turned ice-cold. "We will remind you." A heavy silence settled over the room. For the first time in history, the TZ-carry were under someone else's rule. Not through occupation. Not through enslavement. But through fear. And fear was something humanity understood better than anyone. A new order. Months passed. The Dominion's borders were redrawn. Every remaining world was placed under strict human surveillance. Human ships patrolled their sectors, their mere presence a silent warning. No weapons manufacturing. No military academies. No armies. The TZ-carry were finished. Not because of war. But because war was no longer an option. They had become something unthinkable. Defenseless. The last conversation. It was a year after the fall when Exorvath and Rourke met one final time. The former Dominion admiral sat across from his human counterpart in a neutral chamber, deep in the heart of what remained of the TZ-carry capital. They did not speak at first. Exorvath's claws clicked lightly against the table. He was no longer the warrior who had once commanded fleets across the galaxy. He was a man who had survived something greater than war. Finally he exhaled. "I want to ask you something, Admiral Rourke." Rourke's gaze did not waver. "Go ahead." Exorvath's mandibles twitched slightly before he spoke. "Why did you spare us?" Pause. Then. Rourke leaned forward. "Because," he said, voice quiet, "we wanted you to live with this." Exorvath blinked. Rourke's expression did not change. "If we had wiped you out," he continued, "history would call it a war. A tragedy." His eyes hardened. "But now, you are a lesson." Exorvath's breath caught in his throat. "A lesson. Not a warning. Not an enemy. A lesson. And lessons never fade." Exorvath swallowed. "And if we ever rise again?" Rourke did not smile. He simply held his gaze and said, "You won't." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Because they were. The legacy of the war. For the first time in 1,000 years, the TZ-carry Dominion had no armies. For the first time in 1,000 years, they did not march toward conquest. They could not. Not because of laws. Not because of treaties. But because the last species they had angered had left something behind. Something that ensured the TZ-carry would never again dare raise a weapon. The fear of what lay waiting for them in the void. Because humans never forget. And if the Dominion ever forgot what happened, humanity would remind them. Final report, Admiral Rourke's journal. Date, 1 year after the Dominion's fall. Entry, last thoughts on the war. We didn't exterminate them. We could have, but we didn't. Some might call that mercy. I don't think it was. They will rebuild. They will survive. But they will always look over their shoulders. And they should. Because if they ever forget what happens when you take our children, we will be waiting. The stars remember. And so do we.